welcome to today's episode of Daily Debrief and setting the lens on developments from around the world, brought to you by People's Dispatch. I'm Swastika, and we take a look at what has happened in Sudan. A political agreement has been signed in Sudan enabling MilitaryHamdok to be reinstated as Prime Minister. Sudan's top general Abdel Fattah al-Burhan signed the deal with Hamdok on Sunday. The 14-point deal provides for the release of all political prisoners detained during the coup. Hamdok will return as Prime Minister, but only to head a government of technocrats. Now, the agreement has been widely criticized. And to find out more about this, we have with us Prashant in our studio. Prashant, welcome.
Thank you.
And right at the head of it, there is the Forces of Freedom and Change, which backed Hamdok and was in fact sharing power with the military, has also criticized this agreement. Why is that?
Right, Swastika. So just to give our viewers some context, we know that a coup took place on October 25th. Yeah. The transitional government structure which was there was completely removed. Abdullah Hamdok was briefly arrested. Other ministers in his government were arrested. The Sovereignty Council, which was the topmost body of this Sudanese government, was dissolved. And the military took over full power, right? So that was the context in which all this has happened. Yeah. In the days since, there have been massive protests, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets against this coup, against the military, demanding a full return, a full return to civilian government. So the military, knows that this is a difficult situation, right? So from the very beginning, they were trying to sort of retrieve the situation by giving a civilian face to the new administration. They, of course, would retain all the power, but they wanted to give a civilian face. So they have been in talks with the Prime Minister Hamdok for a very long time. Now, let's consider Hamdok. Hamdok is a representative of what you mentioned, called the Forces of Freedom and Change. These are centrist and sometimes even slightly conservative political parties, which were in alliance with the military until recently, until the coup, right? So the Forces of Freedom and Change wanted a restoration to the old system, where civilian sections and the military shared power. And Hamdok would be the Prime Minister, the military was a part of the ruling establishment, etc. Now, there's one section of the protesters, we'll come to them later, who wanted a full removal of the military from power. But the deal Hamdok has struck right now sees his return to power, the release of all political prisoners, but no representation of the political parties in the new government structure. So it'll be Hamdok heading a government, like you said, of technocrats. Now, who are technocrats? Technocrats are basically experts, maybe, or people who are involved in various specialities. It could be the economy, it could be construction, it could be defense, etc., whatever. But they do not have any popular political support. They do not represent any political forces. So basically what Hamdok has done is strike a deal with the military whereby the whole civilian political component is likely to be excluded from the new governing structure. So there will be a civilian face, which will be Hamdok, and there will be civilian ministers who are like experts, but it will not actually be a political process. So this is what the military has been trying to do since the coup, to give some sort of a saving face for themselves, or to put a front for themselves whereby they can say that, okay, we have got the civilian government back, but actually they're in complete control, because they do not, when the military, when there are political forces, they represent they represent the people, right?
Yes.
Now, when they're technocrats, they don't really represent anybody. So the military does not have to answer to the people in any sense of the term. So that has been the idea of the military, and that is why even the Forces of Freedom and Change, which supported Hamdok, have strongly criticized this, because they also have been excluded. Despite the fact that they were willing to do a compromise with the military, even they have been excluded from this process. So that is why they are angry. That is why the streets of Sudan are completely angry. People's Dispatch has carried a report. Someone has pointed out that Hamdok, who was seen as a hero by at least some sections because he had been arrested and all that, has now become universally a villain for all the protesters.
So actually the fact that the people on the streets are still protesting at this point of time, and to call it that this is a fragile transition towards democracy, in which case, how true is that?
It's not a transition to democracy at all. In fact, it's important to note that various Western governments and all have kind of welcomed this announcement, because it satisfies their, what they want is also not true democracy. So it satisfies their demand that it is a civilian face. But the people on the streets, who have been protesting for years actually, and who especially since October 25th have been protesting in large numbers, as of now at least 41 people are believed to have been killed, including I think a 16-year-old on Sunday. So these people are very clear. The protesters are very clear. They don't want a military. They don't want a military-civilian partnership. they want a civilian government, right? So if you look at the Sudanese Professionals Association, which was at the forefront of the protest, which removed Omar al-Bashir. If you look at, for instance, the Sudanese Communist Party, which has been very active in these protests, the neighborhood resistance committees, which were actually in the forefront of a lot of some protests over the years, all of these forces have made it very clear that they do not want the partnership of blood or the partnership of betrayal or the cowardly partnership. They want a full-fledged civilian government. So they were, as it is, very opposed to the idea of even a return to a military-civilian alliance. And now we have a military-technocrat alliance, for lack of a better word. So it's not even civilian in the sense of centrist political parties being involved, right? It's the entire, the carpet has been taken off their feet, so to speak. So massive anger on the streets of Sudan. I think there is a sense of seeing Hamdok as having betrayed it. Now, he has, of course, said that, he doesn't want blood to be spilled, etc., etc. But let's be clear, the blood is not being spilled because people are killing each other. The blood is being spilled because the army is shooting at people. The security forces are shooting at people, right? So it's the onus is on the military to stop shooting. So the argument that Sudanese blood is precious, which is what Hamdok said, is a very disingenuous one, because the responsibility of stopping that is on the military, and they're not doing so because they don't want to face these protests. So the real question here is basically that, Sudan's situation is still in a flux, which is, I think, something we've been talking about since the coup. That while various sections might say, okay, coup happened, it's over, that the streets are still very volatile. The streets are still, people are on the streets. And we cannot say, we cannot conclude what has happened until this is not a conclusion, is what I'm trying to say. That just because an agreement has been signed, just because we're going to get a civilian prime minister, this is not an end to anything, because the people on the streets are very determined that this partnership does not represent their aspirations, that it does not represent, their idea of how Sudan should be governed. It does not represent the hundreds of people who lost their lives for the removal of Omar al-Bashir, the very infamous dictator who was deposed in 2019 because of mass protests. And we need to remember that in all these processes, it is the protesters and the people on the streets who have taken Sudan forward. If a dictator was removed, it's because of the people. If a constitutional government was put in place, it's because of the people, not because of the military, not because of the establishment, right? So, which is why I think, it's important to see the protesters and the people as the protagonists of this issue, and not, say, a couple of parties or the forces of freedom and change, because more often than not, they are being driven by the protesters rather than leading them.
So the protests will continue to spill the streets of Sudan right now.
Absolutely.
Okay, so streets of Sudan will continue to see protests in the coming days as well, Prashant. Stay with us, because we'll come back to you for our next story as well. Let's go over to Afghanistan. The United Nations on Monday warned that Afghanistan's banking system was facing a collapse, which could have a disastrous impact on people in the country. Now, the UN Development Programme, UNDP, said the economic cost of a banking system collapse and consequent negative social impact would be colossal. The withdrawal of a large amount of aid after the Taliban took over has wrecked the economy, and not much has changed despite multiple appeals by Taliban officials. Now, Prashant, coming back to you, when Taliban took over, there was a lot of conversation around issues surrounding terrorism. But what about the economy? It's in the ICU, so to speak, right now.
Absolutely, Swastika. I'll just read some numbers, including the Reuters report you mentioned. In fact, the UNDP, the United Nations Development Programme, says that 40% of Afghanistan's deposit base will be lost by the end of the year. Okay, or for that matter, that banks have stopped extending credit. The fact that non-performing loans have almost doubled to 57%. And a very vital number, which is that there are $4 billion worth of Afghanis, that's the UNC, Afghan currency, in the economy, of which only 500 million are in circulation, which means the rest of the money is actually being stored or stashed by people because they're so worried of what is going to happen, right? So let's look at some other numbers also. The International Organization for Migration, for instance, has said that half the population is struggling to eat. Malnutrition is in horrible levels. 80% have lost their jobs and livelihoods. And 5.5 million people are internally displaced. And the UNDP earlier had said that the current poverty rate in Afghanistan is 72%, and had warned that it could even cross 90% by the end of the year. So this is really what has happened in a few months. Now let's be clear about a few things. One is that the ultimate responsibility for this lies with the United States and the Western coalition, who over the past 20 years funneled in a massive amount of money into Afghanistan. A lot of it was used for purely military purposes. A lot of it was lost in corruption. And ultimately, the Afghan economy was basically left into a condition where it was just receiving handouts and spending it. Money was being pushed in large amounts. There were no structures that were built. Okay, there were no structures that were built which could create an efficient economy. It was just a kind of economy where huge amounts of aid money was coming in under the auspices of the Americans and the Europeans, and it was being spent in various ways with very little accountability and a lot of corruption. So what happened due to this is that the moment the Americans decided to withdraw after Donald Trump's deal with the Taliban, this thing started crumbling. Just like the Afghan army, which so-called Afghan army on which billions were spent, started crumbled the moment the Americans withdrew.
Yeah.
Like everyone said, okay, the Taliban might come to power soon, but nobody anticipated that the Afghan army would just vanish. Right. Same thing, pretty much the same thing has happened to the Afghan economy as well, in the sense that people who studied this scenario always predicted that this was going to be a risk. And now we're at a position where the economy is completely crumbling. It's important to note that about $10 billion of Afghan reserves have been blocked by the United States, which are in foreign banks. There is a small amount which is blocked by European countries as well. This money has not been released. Taliban officials have been begging for this money, saying that it's our money. It's not even US money. It's not a loan. It's their money which is in US banks or European banks. But these countries have blocked it. The aid that is coming in is extremely difficult. There are withdrawal limits often, at least they were until recently, which means that beyond a point you can withdraw only $200 or something per day. That prevents, for instance, aid from being delivered in large amounts. People are trying to crowdsource, crowdfund. All in all, it's a complete mess.
So with an economy that's completely come to a standstill because there's no way of money moving around, what hope lies ahead?
Right. So this has been, I think, in each time we've discussed Afghanistan, and in various dimensions, this has been a question.
Yes.
Now, there are two aspects to this. One, it's important to note that you can't but help get the feeling that finances are being used by the Western powers to sort of continue to have a stake in Afghanistan. Now, the United States withdrew militarily. Basically, it was a defeat. There's no other way of putting it.
Yeah.
Like, they realized they couldn't continue fighting that war. They withdrew. But financially, they still have a stake. Right, financially, and the United States and the allies, that is the European countries, still have a stake because, like I said, the bulk of the Afghan economy was being run from there, through the money coming from there. So while the Americans left the mess for the people of Afghanistan and the neighboring countries to sort, they still have the whip hand, so to speak, in terms of money. And it's an open question whether they are using this as leverage to kind of try to work. To try to work with to try to work in Afghanistan, because the United States continues to have a stake in the region, also because its strategic interest is in containing China and Russia. They don't care about Afghanistan. We all know that, right? So its strategic interest is in containing China and Russia, and they are of course worried that if China and Russia establish, are able to prop up Afghanistan, for instance, and there is a coalition that is built for this reason, it could be a problem for them. So it is possible to argue that the US interests actually lie in Afghanistan continuing to remain unstable. Just as the US interests continue to lie in, say, West Asia remaining unstable or North Africa remaining unstable, right? Or the Horn of Africa for that matter. So that's actually a big question in terms of how these countries are approaching it. There have been all these good statements about, we want to help, etc., etc., but very little concrete action. And as far as the countries in the region are concerned, they're not in a position to financially, support it beyond a point, right? So the Chinese and the Russians, the countries like Tajikistan, for that matter, even India and Pakistan, all of them want stability in the region. They don't want Afghanistan to descend into utter chaos.
Yeah.
But in order for that to not happen, there has to be financial stability. And it's an open question as to whether the countries in the region alone can ensure that. Now, the other question, of course, is that obviously there's a lot of backroom discussions and negotiations going on. A lot of these countries talking together, trying to work together. And we've always talked about the fact that, the Taliban is an odious organization. It is a horrible organization with very regressive values. Nobody's denying that. But the price of the Taliban's this thing cannot be paid by ordinary Afghani citizens. You cannot say that, okay, we disagree, the Taliban is a bad organization, and so we are going to make everyone in Afghanistan suffer. You can't say that. There has to be some kind of a via media where you engage with the Taliban, even while being critical of all its policies and even while trying to push it in a particular direction, which is what the countries of the region are doing. On the other hand, it's an open question as to whether the West is willing to do that, primarily because I suspect it sees a stable Afghanistan as an obstacle to its ultimate goal, which is containing Russia and China.
Well, Afghanistan certainly is in a very tricky spot.
Absolutely.
And working the economy out will be series of steps and series of negotiations. We'll
Right.
keep an eye on that as well. It's a country that has found itself in a new place now. So
Yeah.
let's see how that pans out. Now, moving on to our next story. Last week, UK Home Secretary Priti Patel announced the government's decision to ban Hamas in totality, claiming that it can no longer differentiate between the group's military and political wings. Several Palestinian groups have condemned the move by the UK's conservative government to ban the activities of Palestinian resistance group Hamas by terming it as a terrorist organization. Now, activists called it as an attempt to please the Zionist lobby in the country and the Israeli government. Now, Prashant, coming back to you again, why did UK take this step now?
Right. So, as we know, Hamas is it's a Palestinian organization. It's been going for decades. It basically controls Gaza right now after winning the elections in 2007. And of course, Hamas is not a popular organization among many groups because of its politics, its links to the Muslim Brotherhood, for instance. Nonetheless, the fact is that Hamas is a legitimate organization, right?
Yes.
And there's no real way of denying it. You cannot say that, we refuse to see Hamas, or, it doesn't exist. It's a legitimate organization. And the fact is basically that, for instance, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO of President Mahmoud Abbas, which controls the West Bank, and Hamas have had negotiations about new elections. New elections were supposed to be held recently. So now the real question is that what is the UK's angle on this?
Yes.
Now the UK has already in the past banned the military wing of Hamas. Okay, this is a ban on the political wing, because it now says, like you said, that there is no way to distinguish between the political and the military wing. And now, of course, what this ban means, let's be clear, this ban is not official yet because it'll have to go to Parliament and then be passed, but one can expect it to be passed. So what does this ban mean? The ban means that membership is, could land you in jail, you cannot do any fundraising activities, you cannot do any kind of promotional activities, etc., etc. All that is part of it. But the larger politics here is something else entirely. And the larger politics here, of course, being that as far as the United Kingdom is concerned, this brings it to the same level as America, the US, and EU, all of which have banned Hamas in that way. And we do know, of course, that calling Palestinian organizations terrorist is one of the oldest and most common, practices of the Western organizations. Nobody, of course, is concerned about Israel, which bombed Gaza for 11 days. Nobody's calling it a terrorist country, but Hamas is a terrorist organization. That's one aspect of it. Now, point number two is the fact that this is also part of a series of engagements between the Israeli and the British governments over the past many months. Apparently, the Israeli intelligence agency Shin Bet had a lot to do with this decision. Their officials had visited Britain. They held a lot of discussions. There's also speculation that this is a way to sort of differentiate the Conservatives and from the Labour Party a bit more, use this issue to beat up the Labour Party, accuse it of anti-Semitism, etc., etc. But ultimately, the fact remains that this is a very unfortunate move because everyone has been talking about the need for engagement, right? And we do know that Gaza is going through a very difficult situation. We'll talk about that later. But instead of engagement, these kind of steps actually basically tend to criminalize Palestinians more. You're saying that an organization which Palestinians in Gaza elected in an election in 2007 is a terrorist organization. What does it mean for the people who elected Hamas? All of them are terrorists? Is that the understanding? So, and we're referring specifically to the political wing. Okay. So is that the understanding you're giving? So basically, it's not surprising that even organizations in Palestine which disagree with Hamas, which have issues with Hamas, have condemned this because they see this as part of a global strategy to criminalize everything they do. And we talked about this multiple times on the show in the past. This has been Israel's strategy. This has been the strategy of Israel's allies. Criminalize every aspect of Palestinian life. Call them, if there are human rights organizations, call them terrorists. If there are activists, call them terrorists. If there are prisoners, call them terrorists. So it's really part of this larger strategy. The UK, of course, the Conservative government doing it obviously for its own domestic political reasons, right? But nonetheless, these two align.
So how does this affect Hamas and the Palestinians?
Right, it's a good question in terms of, I don't know if the UK's designation is going to make a huge difference. It might affect some of its fundraising, undoubtedly. It might affect some of its, activities, say, in various other phases, not in terms of its military stuff, but in terms of its political engagement with, people in the UK, etc., etc. But ultimately, on Palestine, I don't think this is going to make a huge difference. So what could make a difference is the recent decision to declare human rights organizations as terrorists, for instance. But Hamas has enough problems and Gaza has enough problems as it is, because we do know that after the election which Hamas won, Israel and Egypt decided together to block Gaza. Yeah, so the blockade of Gaza has been going on for nearly 14 years now. It has turned Gaza into what the UN has called the biggest open-air prison in the world. Anytime there is any difference of opinion between Israel and Gaza, Israel blocks the crossings through which goods enter Gaza, right? And that creates huge amounts of problem. We've seen multiple attacks on Gaza in recent times, including the 2021 bombings I referred to.
Yes.
Which not only killed a lot of people, but also destroyed the infrastructure, destroyed the health infrastructure, the educational infrastructure across the enclave as well. So on the ground, is it going to make a big difference? No, but like I said, this is part of a larger campaign. And the bigger issue, of course, on the ground is the blockade, which mercilessly Israel and Egypt have been conducting. There has been no it has been relentless in terms of how it has destroyed and squeezed the lives of people in Gaza. And for no real end game or whatever. And this has not helped this has obviously not helped peace in any way. This has destroyed the lives of millions of people in Gaza. And this is one of those brutal practices which we need to keep remembering and coming back to the fact that for 14 years, the people in Gaza have been blockaded.
In fact, our reporters from People's Dispatch are keeping an eye on this region as well. And there'll be more on this from us. Moving on to our next story. Finally, we are talking about something which seems to be kind of out of place in the 21st century, the Miss Universe contest, a beauty pageant. The 70th Miss Universe pageant is being staged in the southern Israeli resort city of Eilat. Greece has a third contestant after the second Miss Greece of the year withdrew citing health concerns. Now, the first Miss Greece of the year, Rafaela Plastera, had earlier withdrawn citing solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. There have been many calls for boycotts of the event, citing Israel's apartheid policies. So now, Prashant, what are your thoughts on what's going on with this pageant?
I think John Oliver's show in the United States has a segment called Why Is This Even a Thing? And Miss Universe is one of those concepts which really kind of fits into that category. Why is Miss Universe even a thing now is really, shouldn't have been a thing ever, especially now, why is it even a thing? But nonetheless, it's an important site of struggle for the Palestinian movement. Important to note that, because Israel has been using these kind of events. There was a Eurovision contest earlier, Miss Universe contest now, to kind of normalize its existence and its policies. So, you have people from all over the world coming for a global competition, taking part which is being held in Israel, and that kind of legitimizes a lot of what Israel is doing. Now, two important things to note. The first Miss Greece, like you said, Rafaela Plastera, took a brave stand, I thought, in declaring this. The converse of that has been from South Africa, where the reigning Miss South Africa has decided to go for the pageant. And the organizers of Miss South Africa have supported the decision, despite the fact that the government has demanded that she not go. So, in fact, I think the government is cutting off support to Miss South Africa for that reason, because South Africa has for long been a very strong ally of the Palestinian people. The struggle of the South Africans against apartheid has been seen as very in parallel to the Palestinian people's struggle against Israel. So it's especially bitter when a Miss South Africa goes to Israel to participate in this contest.
Yes.
So there's been a massive amount of campaigning taking place in South Africa, huge, a lot of calls for boycott, like I said, in many other parts of the world. So I think while we all probably agree that the Miss Universe contest should probably be held in another planet, definitely not on Earth, nonetheless, the fact remains that this is also a site for struggle, so an important thing to maybe keep note of as well.
Thank you, Prashant, and we will come back to you with our next episode of Daily Debrief. Keep watching People's Dispatch.